Hello there, my Attachment Theory in Action podcast listeners and viewers. I'm your host, Jenna Kelly, and I hope this interview finds you well wherever you are listening or watching this today. I am really excited to share this next conversation with you. And I know I say that about all of my guests, but it's really true because I get to sit down and talk with people who are very knowledgeable and willing to share their knowledge and expertise and wisdom and resources with us. So I do that in the deepest of gratitude. And this next conversation is no exception because I get to sit down with Dr. Jean Clinton, who is really a gem in the field of infant and early childhood mental health and attachment and in bringing the brain science into that. Dr. Jean optimistically believes that having a system of compassionate system awareness leadership, competency-based deep learning, and relationally focused education of our children and young people is the road to a better and sustainable world. Good at learning means good at life. Dr. Clinton has authored her first book, Love Builds Brains, which is also a gem in books because she brings so much just authenticity to this with the stories in her book and really taking the brain science and making it digestible and understandable. And that's what she's all about. She's also a clinical professor at the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Neurosciences at McMaster University, Division of Child Psychiatry in Ontario, Canada. She was also appointed as an education advisor to the Premier of Ontario and the Minister of Education from 2014 to 2018. She's a trainer in Dr. Bruce Perry's neurosequential model in education. She's worked intensively with Michael Fullen and his new pedagogies for deep learning team. She is also a member of the Mind Up Scientific Advisory Board, as well as a Mind Up for Families advisor. Dr. Jean is a fellow of the Child Trauma Academy and has been a 0 to 3 Academy Fellow since 2013. She's been working as a consultant to children and youth mental health programs, child welfare, and primary care for over 35 years. Her special interest lies in brain development and the crucial role relationships, belonging, and connectedness play. And that's really what we talk about in this interview. As you can see, she's got a wealth of knowledge and experience as a child psychiatrist, working for over 35 years. And so we talk about the brain science and how that relates to attachment, both in the early years and in the mysterious adolescent brain, and how things like the pandemic have impacted that, what our policymakers need to know. She just sucked me in. I was so just enthralled and engaged in this interview. And so I really hope that you all enjoy and learn as much as I did. Enjoy. Hello, Dr. Jean, and welcome. I am so excited and honored to be joining you in conversation today. Thank you so much for being here.
My pleasure, Jenna. Really looking forward to our conversation.
Yes, me as well. It's kind of been a long time in the making. I know we've had a lot of emails back and forth, and we did a pre-chat, and it's finally here. It's really happening. And the reason I'm so excited is because you really speak the language of attachment and brain development and neuroscience and building resilience and infant and early childhood mental health. I mean, there's so many rabbit holes that we could go down, but before we do, I'd also like to start with you, and I would invite you to please share an attachment memory that feels really important to you and to your work. What comes up for you?
Well, it's there are a couple of attachment memories that come to mind. One is a kind of weird one with my partner, my husband. He once had to have an MRI done, and at that time he was a pretty large guy, and he had been a bit worried about fitting in the machine, but also he had to put his arm up in a very uncomfortable position, and it was really hard for him. And what he did is he thought about me being outside, knowing that I was there. So even as I'm describing it again, I'm tearing up a little. So I think that is an example of real attachment. In the adult sphere, with my kids, and Jenna, as you know, I have 5 children, aged 29 to 39, and I have 8 grandchildren now. 5 months to 7 years of age, so you can imagine our life. And so I have many, many memories of my children coming to me with delight about what they've done. So the delight part of attachment, and one of them was my oldest son when he was about 2.5 or 3. He had peeled some wallpaper off in the bathroom when he had been sitting doing his business. And when I came in to help him, he said, "Look, Mama, a D, a D." So that's the delight of attachment. But in other ways, when one of my kids was injured, they kind of kept everything in until I arrived, and the relief, the turning to me in that moment just was a very, very, very special moment. Now, mind you, it was when my kid had a head injury, so maybe it was, no, only joking. He had got off a thing. But so many times when the kids have been in need, and it's very clear they're turning to me, has been really important, and lovely, lovely memories.
Yes, you represent such a secure base for your husband and your children and grandchildren. So thank you for sharing that with us. So, Dr. Jean, you're known as the knowledge translator, and I would love for you to tell us why. Tell us more about that.
Yeah, well, I'm a knowledge translator. I think there are other people out there. What I mean by that, and it was somebody commented to me about that many years ago, and I said, "Oh, that's exactly it." So I take the science of attachment, the science of regulation, and the science, as I'm thinking as well, of bullying research. And I think about ways that I would be able to communicate those sometimes pretty dense and difficult concepts into ways that are accessible, that people can reach and understand. And so that's the translation of it. I sometimes joke and say that I'm a magpie, that I'd love to steal lovely, bright, shiny ideas and bring them into my own nest, and then translate them in a way that other people can understand them. Yeah, so that's the knowledge translation, and it's so important for me to think about, as a infant, child, and adolescent psychiatrist, to think about being upstream. So to be thinking about, so I spent many, many years feeling that I was downstream in a rushing river of kids with mental health problems and families with difficulties. And I would always be thinking, if only something had happened earlier, if only people had reached out and knew the importance of relationship and attachment. And so a number of years ago, I decided that, and through a mentor who said, "Jean, we need to prevent the kids from falling in the river in the first place." And so knowledge translation is a huge part of that concept of me being an upstreamist. Now, periodically, I'm an extremist as well, particularly with government, but liking to be upstream, and knowledge translation is a big part of that.
Well, I'm sure we'll get on that soapbox a little bit later with what can policymakers do, but they need knowledge translated as well. And it's so important because, like you said, there is so much going on with the science, but if people don't understand what we're talking about, then it never leads to any meaningful action either. So
Oh,
I'm so glad.
so true. You know, one of the uh, feel good moments as a knowledge translator for me was when I had the great opportunity of working with some of Canada's judges. And I would, because I felt for a number of reasons. One, it's really super important. Well, one, I was invited, but the other is it's super important for judges to be aware of what toxic stress and instability does to the early relationships and to infant and early childhood mental health. So I often talk when I'm talking, I talk about every child should have at least one adult whose eyes light up when they enter the room. And then one of the judges from I think Alberta, Canada, said, I am now going to write in my orders for these little ones that the people who are there need to find at least one adult whose eyes light up for them. So that you know, that was a moment of thinking, you know, not seeing so many kids because I'm on the road so much. This is making it worth it.
Yes. When we know better, we can do better. That was
I
the
love
big
that,
hint.
Maya Angelou. Yeah.
So was that the motivation for your book, Love Builds Brains, which is an amazing resource full of knowledge that you've translated, and you've used stories and the way you share knowledge in that book, I think is such a beautiful example of how you are truly a knowledge translator. So was that the motivation for this book? Tell us more about the book.
Well, yeah. Well, you know, thank you for mentioning the book, Jenna. It's I have, as you know, I have a very, very busy, eclectic life with the family. And, you know, people had said to me, oh, Jean, you need to write a book. Other people who don't come and hear you need to be able to hear what you're pulling together from other scientists and how you do it. So I'd been hearing that for a while. And then one of my dear, dear friends, Dr. Joyce Bellis, who heard me in Hamilton and immediately got in touch with me. She was a divinity professor at the time at McMaster, but she has a small printing company. And she said, Jean, we're going to do it. So what she and her wonderful husband, Ken, what they actually did was record the number of talks that I did for each of the chapters. And then Joyce and I got together and sat with that transcript and made it into a book. We spent hours and hours together, relishing in each other's company. You know, I'm strongly attached to my dear friend. And that's how the book came about. My friend saying, this has to be heard and read by others. So I'm very pleased that I actually got to do it. I'm planning this December to make it into an audio book. So that's going to be fun. Lots of people now have said, now, Jean, you have to make an audiobook so we can listen to it when we're walking or in the car or whatever. And I'm quite thrilled that a number of early childhood educators and education programs are using the book, either for the childcare centre or groups doing book studies. And we've developed a study guide recently, or they're incorporating it into their education of ECEs. So I tell you, it's so weird, Jenna, when I do a presentation to ECEs, all these people want to have selfies done with me. So we do that. And, you know, they say, oh, I studied you in school. I did a project on you. And, you know, I go, what? I think of myself just as me, but yeah, it was a great process, and I'm really thrilled that it's reaching out to others, changing their views of how they interact with kids little ones in a very positive way.
Yes. I can see that the book having broad application, and as humble as we try to be in our work, you are a big deal, Dr. Jean, and you are spreading so much wisdom that people need to hear, and like I said, in an easy, digestible way. But speaking of the early years, there's so much emphasis on that in the book and in your work. Why is that such a critical period for healthy child and brain development? And what role does attachment play in this?
Well, so my journey to studying the early years began, let me see, how old is Kathleen? So about 36 or 37 years ago, when I was finishing up my residency program, my training in psychiatry and child psychiatry. And the place where I was working really wanted to start a preschool psychiatry program, looking at what is the issues, what happens to children who are 0 to 6 in the world. So this is 1986 or thereabouts. And at that time, we knew from really good observations that scientists had done, like John Bowlby and others, that when infants were separated from their parents, when they were not well looked after by their parents or not responded to by their parents, that was Mary Ainsworth's work, that the children protested in some kind of way. And so that was the beginning of thinking about attachment. But we did not have the neuroscience at that time. And so so I continued to do my work as a preschool and psychiatrist, developing the program here at McMaster Children's Hospital now. And I encountered, let's say, Dr. Fraser Mustard, who had actually been my dean at medical school. But he was asked to write a report for the premier at the time. It was a guy called Mike Harris, and this is something that he brought people together to look at. What do we know about the science behind why children really need to have significant adults attend to them in the earliest years? So he pulled together neuroscience, child development, social economic development. He pulled together a whole lot of science in his study, the early years, and this would have been in 1999 or 90, anyway, around there. And I met him and was completely changed, because he not only was saying, we have to pay attention to the early years, but he was bringing together the why of it. And so then I started, I heard Bruce Perry a number of times. I was blown away by Bruce. And so what I've learned, and we continue to learn in this journey, is, and it's different than when I started, is that the brain of little babies in utero, so even before they're born, into their early years, and that's 5 years of age, 6 years of age, sometimes even longer, that their brains are not fully formed in terms of all of the interconnections between the big main brain cell, which is called a neuron. So what happens in the early years literally builds the architecture of the brain and the person that child is going to become. So when I say it builds the architecture, we know that all of the brain cells are in place when a baby is born, but their little heads when they come out only weigh about 1 pound, but by the time they're a toddler, is increased in size to about 3 pounds. Now, there's a very good reason why we deliver babies when their heads are 1 pound, because it would be not a pretty picture.
Yes, thank goodness for that.
To deliver a 3 pound baby, but a baby's head. But so that, you know, and that Jay Gould and other scientists have talked about that. So what we know then is that babies, how the brain grows is not new neurons, but new connections between those neurons, new synapses, new cells that support that interaction. So this was breakthrough. This was breakthrough to be able to actually see this. You know, of course, they did it in animal studies first, but some of the scientists said, wow, if the brain is born or delivered so early, it means that we need to create an external womb. If that brain is so immature that it doesn't mature well fully, we'll talk a little bit about the adolescent brain, but in those early years, it means we really need to pay attention to how those brains are being sculpted, how they are being built. Because what we know from Canadian scientists, a guy called Hebb, was that the neurons, those brain cells that fire together, actually, the more they fire, the more they wire up together. So what does this mean? This means that the experience a baby, little one, has is building that connection in all parts of their brain as they're being spoken to, their language areas, as they're being read to, read to your child, because like there's 6 different senses or different input pathways when you're reading to your child. And what is literally happening is, as the repetitive over and over stimulation occurs, that connection and that interconnectivity happens. So what's really cool about that is we used to think that it was genes that determined your brain, your intelligence, all of that kind of stuff. But now we know, wait a second. And, you know, it's funny, I used to have arguments at my first degree is music. And we would go to the pub, music and philosophy, no less. We would go to the pub and we'd argue, what counts more, nature or nurture? Is it genetics or is it the environment? And now we know that, we didn't know this in 86, in 81. What we now know is that the genes are listening to the environment. That is, when the stimulation comes in, that activates down to the cellular level whether parts of the DNA are going to be turned off or turned on to make a protein that's going to contribute to intelligence, is going to contribute to you being able to deal with a cold, you know, that the whole immune system. So this is called epigenetics. So what was amazing that we've discovered is that we knew that in utero, but we didn't know that there were these little chemical signals, messengers, that could occur after babies were born. So that means, as me thinking clinically, you know, what's the implication for this? That means that when a baby is looked after, picked up, whenever they cry, somebody's trying to figure out, what's up with you? Yeah, I see you're upset. You're allowed to have a little upset, but I'm going to soothe you. What the problem, and another body of research came in, was looking at, and this was the work of Bruce McEwen, he looked and saw that when animals are highly stressed, as would be happening when a baby's not being soothed, when the physiology, the body's reaction to stress, like being cold, being hungry, being frightened, it turns on a whole cascade, a whole bunch of stuff that is called our stress response system. And what we're now putting together is that when your stress response system is too turned on all the time, pressure, 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 when you are a very little child, it releases adrenaline and cortisol and all kinds of stuff goes on in the brain. And that sets a pattern in your brain of when you get stressed later on. You know, you may hyperreact. That's really relevant for medicine because there's good studies. We'll talk about the ACEs, but I want to bring all of this back to attachment. Mm-hmm. So here we know this brain is immature at birth. We need to create the environment to make the best, sturdiest house that we can. Oh boy, we need to minimize stress as well, because we know that when there's too much stress, there's differences happen in the inside of the brain. So we got to look after our babies really, really, really well. And we have to look after our babies and think about how can we create the conditions that they are maybe a little bit stressed, because, you know, a little bit stressed is okay, but that they're not overly stressed. And so that's when we come back to, oh boy, oh boy, oh boy, this is attachment. This is helping families and caregivers know that when that baby is upset, distressed, or crying, they're releasing a ton of neurochemicals, which, if it happens all the time, can affect how their brain is developing. So when a baby sends out, so that's one thing. Now, me, I'm a big suck. I don't really need the neuroscience to tell me that I have to pick up my crying baby, but it's pretty important for others, and including policymakers that we'll talk about. But, you know, here we've got the science now saying what your grandmother told you to do with infants, what the First Nations people have been telling us to do for ages, and that is create an attachment relationship that is secure. Mm-hmm. That when the child is upset, distressed, overwrought, that they've got somebody in their court who is their best bet, as Dr. Deborah McNamara talks about. And so that's the relationship. And so when that happens consistently, the child develops a view of themselves that I am lovable. They learn how to regulate their own self. I am lovable. I have stuff I can offer and contribute as a toddler. And that's secure attachment. So they're well loved, but they're well responded to in secure, nurturing, positive relationships. But then sometimes this doesn't happen. And kids can develop, and it doesn't happen in two pathways. One is because the adult in their life is not responding consistently, positively, predictably to them. And so they can develop an insecure form of attachment. But there's also, from the infant's perspective, sometimes infants, sometimes genetic, sometimes things like autism or other conditions, they're very hard to read. So there can be attachment problem there. I am not saying that all children with autism don't have secure attachments, because that just ain't so. They
Right.
absolutely can attach. But you get the picture of secure attachment, which is what we want. So we don't talk about good or bad attachment. We talk about secure. The examples I think of when I came in and my son was just, oh, mom, it's so good to see you. I'm so happy you're here. Is, to me, that secure attachment. Why is it so important? Because longitudinal studies, so following people for the same people over a long period of time, shows us that when you have in your early years a secure attachment, the world feels like a good place for you. Those children, on average, grow up to have, on average, so not every single one, better relationships. They do better academically, they do better behaviorally. So this architecture of the brain that's being constructed, that is built by back and forth interactions and responding, lasts a long time. It lasts a very long time. So it's why we really need to be supporting young families. But here's the irony. At the time when their kids need them the most, look at how young families are stressed. So that means, and this is policy again, that means societally, we need to be upping the ante. We need to be creating attachment connections in the community for our families. But that's me drifting away too far. So that's why attachment is so important. Now, I don't want parents who are listening to think, oh my God, I let my kid cry it out once. Have I damaged them? It's not. And I just did worked with a author in the Motherly, the woman who, or the journal Motherly magazine. And we really emphasized that don't beat yourself up. Like we said, you do the best you can until you know better. And
Yeah.
what we have is a beautiful brain that is able to be repaired. Relationship is the glue. Love can releases all kinds of stuff in the brain, stuff very technical, that actually can repair. So to say, I didn't get that right. Come on, let's try this again. What was it you wanted, my boy? What is it you wanted? So the beautiful thing of repair. And we see this with children in childcare who have high quality childcare, who may have traumatic backgrounds and live in difficult situations, but they come in and they can attach. They can attach securely to their caregivers or teachers. I have so many stories about kids who started off without everything that I'm talking about and met somebody in school, a teacher, a coach, that power of one we can't forget about. But I'm in the business of pulling all those powers of one together so that we make a change for kids.
Yes. I think we could just go back and play that everything you just shared in those last several minutes as such powerful messages around why attachment is so important in the early years and how trauma and stress can impact that, but also bringing a level of grace and compassion to that, because parents and adults don't always get it right. And what can be more damaging over time is when those ruptures are unacknowledged and we don't learn how to repair. And yet, even though a lot of that early brain development, there's so much happening in those first few years, the brain is still malleable and changes can happen throughout the lifetime. So thank you for sharing so much wisdom in your response to that question. You also mentioned the adolescent brain, which is also a critical time of growth, and attachment also plays a big role in that. So can you share more about the adolescent brain? Because
Yeah,
that's a
great.
mystery. Those brains
Yeah.
are.
Well, you know what? It remains a mystery because each adolescent is their own individual, but we know a little bit more about the adolescent brain than we did before. So scientists knew about all of this big change that happens in the early years, and I mean neuroscientists and others. And most psychologists have looked at for years and years and years about the behavior of adolescents. And they were thinking, oh, well, it's hormones, you know, they're going through this. It's because their hormones are changing this and that and this and that. And, you know, expect storm and stress and all of that lot. But then neuroscientists, people who study the brain with imaging, like MRI machines, scanned the same children over a number of years and realized, wow, it's not just in the early years that the brain is being sculpted and changed by the experiences, but massively is happening in adolescence. So what we say and know about the adolescent brain is that it is under construction. It's not hormones. Hormones play a big part. They may trigger the beginning of these brain changes, but what is happening is it's kind of like getting specialized. What kind of adult, what kind of, how am I going to be, what am I going to be interested in? All those kind of things. The brain, behaviorally, you see that, but inside the brain, you see that there's sculpting. What doesn't get used gets snipped away, just like we do see. We didn't mention that in the early years, but there's much more specialization, snipped away, neurons that aren't used. The neurons become more myelinated, which is like insulation, and the neurons fire faster, and when they get this repeated signal. So what it means is that what adolescents are being told, what they are engaging in, is also sculpting their brain. So two kind of scenarios. If they are in a high quality education system that believes that they are competent and capable and able to engage in community projects and focus on learning how to be how to communicate, how to think critically, how to collaborate, how to have compassion. If you're in a school system like that, your brain is wiring up very differently. If you're a kid who is busy with school, in the school play, engaged in different clubs, has coaches little kids, your brain is being wired up differently than if you have a child, a young person who is in the basement playing Fortnite, Grand Theft Auto. How the brain is being used is becoming specialized. Let's get this. Okay, you're doing this over and over again. All right, let's wire that up. Okay, so you're not playing guitar anymore. We're going to knock off those neurons because now you are doing this fantastic project in pottery, whatever things. Now, you might think that that scenario I painted about your school is pie in the sky, but it's not. I visited schools like this. We need to change the way we do school, but that's another whole podcast. So not only do we now know that the brain is changing, but that the different areas of the brain change, get sculpted away and remyelinate at different times. So deep in the brain, the emotional system is developing. It's under construction way before the top part of the brain, we call the cortex, and the prefrontal cortex particularly, is fully ready. So we've got fantastic ability to think and problem solve and be creative. But when there's an emotional hit, like hot emotions, then there is not as much connection to the, oh, stop, plan, think about this, brain. It's not, that evolves over time. Your prefrontal cortex is the last area of the brain. You know, that's your planning, organizing, emotional ability, all of that stuff, until 25 to 28 years of age. So we've got a long time to do it right with our kids if we've had other, you know, other tussles. So that's a huge knowledge for us to have that was not available before, that neuroscience has opened up for us. And so we see fantastic development of, so for example, one of my friends, Kim Schoen at Reichel, developed a tool called the Middle Development Instrument. So they look at kids in the grade 4, grade 7, and now they're looking at teens. And they ask the kids things like, do you have a caring adult in the school? How many caring adults do you have in the school? So we've got the attachment research is coming in with the neuroscience saying relationships really count. So where I am in Hamilton, they did this middle development instrument, and they said, holy moly, we thought, the teachers had all said, this is a percentage of kids that we think we're important to. And the kids came in, and guess what? Big difference. So they said, wow, the emotional well-being of the kids is really important. Their brains are under construction. Let's create conditions where they're engaged and they like school, but they feel safe, significant, like they're loved and validated, and they know why they're here. That's the work of my dear friend Stephen de Groot. So the neuroscience and the attachment, looking at relationship is changing how we think about adolescence. It is magnificent how we can start to change what kids experience in school, at home, in community, using this knowledge.
Yes. And Dr. Jean, I've heard you talk a lot about the impacts of the pandemic on everything you just shared, on brain development, on attachment, on our stress response system. You were such a voice during the pandemic on your YouTube channel, Dr. Jean Talks, when people needed it the most, when we were all feeling so just isolated and scared, and you were out there just sharing this kind of knowledge and trying to help the adults learn better ways to calm themselves so that they could be there for children and meeting their needs. So I'm wondering, what are you seeing are the ripple effects from the pandemic, and what do we do?
Yeah, well, you know, it's first of all, there's no question that the pandemic has had a big impact on young people's mental health, on their behavioral development, and the very little kids. There has been an effect. There are some who say there hasn't been, and I don't know what they're reading. Because it's very, very clear, and that's the Dr. Tracy Viancourt has really looked steadily at this. So we know that it's the kids have taken a big hit. Hopefully it informs what we do should something else come around. But what we can do about it, and they've taken a big hit because there was huge social isolation that we saw in the very little kids, concern about they're not being socialized with other adults, they're not being socialized with other kids, the parents are stressed, the community's stressed. Yeah, they're on iPhones and you know, on smartphones and tablets and all that kind of stuff. So the stress system of the world went up. Now, what we know about stress systems is it's not only about how much stress there is, but what do you do to bring that stress down to be manageable? So we know in some studies that when kids were able to stay connected when they were able to figure out ways to do something productive. Like there's a gorgeous gorgeous story from Newfoundland and Labrador, the school district there, where the kids connected over Zoom. They developed a song with a local songwriter about what it was like in through that. So that diminishes the stress. So we know that the kids who had that opportunity, we know that their empathy, in fact, went up. Their citizenship desire went up because, you know, having to look out for Nana and Papa, that's a good thing to do. So, two sides of the coin. What do we do about it? Well, I think, first of all, we need to absolutely recognize that relationships, connection, creating a sense of belonging has to be a priority because kids have lost and missed out on that. I worry when I hear the dialogues about, oh, learning loss, you know, there's big gaps. What are we going to do about it? Well, the gaps are going to get bigger if we do not say, excuse me, what is our kids need? They need to feel safe, to feel significant, that they belong, that they've got connection, and they need what they're doing is important. So we can create conditions where kids, even though they may not be at the reading level or, you know, at the science acquisition of knowledge that they should be, but if we put them in a cradle or a container of high positive regard with high expectations, people who care about them, people who say, how can we do this in ways that you're interested in? We are going to see that learning loss diminish. In the early years, excuse me, in the early years, I worry if we don't educate in a way that people knew or know about, but more deeply, if we don't educate about the importance of social and emotional learning. And that to me is all about knowing what my feelings are, knowing how to manage those feelings, knowing how to express those feelings is hugely important. I think little kids did not get that. That's why we're seeing so much disruption in kindergarten these days. Now, there's also an issue of class size, but that's another podcast. And so when those little ones are coming in, we need to say the number one thing we need to work on is you loving being here. What do we need to do so that you love coming to school? And I'll tell you, it ain't drill and kill about knowing their alphabet. It's about what do you love to do? Let's do that together. Oh, and by the way, how many of your friends are here sitting with us as we're playing with the blocks? I see 1, 2, 3. Look at 3. So you absolutely can do both. You absolutely can have playful learning, and that way we're going to catch the kids up. But, you know, catch the kids up to what? As another whole discussion, another whole discussion. So key concepts are relationship. Key concepts are what is the curriculum drive? If it is, for example, in the early years, to get those kids ready for kindergarten or grade 1, I mean, I got trouble in my mind with that. But if it is develop a lifelong learning and a ability to get along with others, take turns and have empathy when somebody falls down, the science is perfectly clear. The kids in the early years where that is how they arrive at school, they do far, far better throughout life. So if we're talking about COVID, we need to reframe and say, well, what are the possibilities here? Not what are the problems, what are the
Mhm.
possibilities here? What do we know to be true? And it is when the kids feel safe, they feel they belong, then they feel that they've got a purpose in being there and they're not disruptive. They're excited, they're engaged, all of those things.
Yeah, I think if we can prioritize attachment, that's the possibility that then, and for the adults that are caring for them and teaching them and parenting them, to also prioritize their own attachment needs with themselves and with others, so that their stress response systems can be in a place to really offer that to children.
Yeah, well, it's such a good point that if we can help the adults in children's lives manage their stress more better in ways that make them available and be able to meet the needs of the kids, then the kids are going to do better. That was something that was absent in a lot. So how do we help the adults with their stress? Well, we know absolutely that when you have a routine, when you have a rhythm in your life, the brain likes that.
Mm-hmm.
When you have good sleep, the brain likes that. When you have connections to others, when you're generous, brings down the stress. When you go out running, brings down the stress. So there are many things that we can do as adults. Have self-compassion.
Mm-hmm.
That brings down the stress. And, remember, I'm a child psychiatrist, so I like that because it's how you then interact with the kids. And if we can, like using the MDI, if we can have adults recognize the huge role that they play in children's lives as coaches, as teachers, in that way. But we need to address the stress of the adults in the system for sure.
Absolutely. So we've mentioned policymakers. What knowledge do they need translated so that they can better understand this and support healthy attachment and brain development?
Yeah, well, it's a mixed bag asking about policymakers, because one, they're bombarded with so many things that they have to attend to. So we need to, and I think people have done this quite successfully, develop key messages. Here's the neuroscience in a nutshell. Here's why serve and return is so important. Here's why high quality childcare is so important. Here's why parental leave is, so I could give you a list.
Mm-hmm.
And the Harvard Center on the Developing Child is a fabulous resource for that. They've got a great one on for policymakers in Alberta. The Alberta Family Wellness Initiative has got great resources there. But you can make all of these wonderful presentations. Here's the science, but the receptor can either take up, as they have in British Columbia and other places, or they can ignore it and stick to their belief system rather than actually changing and being informed by the science. So it's not, we need to find ways to figure out what is front of mind for the politicians, for policymakers, what's front of mind. And for that, we need to know how are the parents, how are the adults in the system pressuring the policymakers, not fringe groups, but the majority of the populace, and then work very, very diligently to create relationships with government to then, at the right time and moment, you get the door opened to be able to create new ways of being. Like we had everything so beautifully aligned until, in terms of early learning and care here in Canada, until we got a change of government.
Mm.
So it's a challenge. It's a challenge if the ideology in the policymakers is very, very different than what yours is. So you have to find the arguments that resonate with who they think are their the key people. I must say, I've had great highs working with policymakers. I was an advisor to one of the premiers of Ontario and the Minister of Education with one government, and with another, I haven't heard a peep from them.
Mm-hmm.
And they're doing stuff that is very against the science of what children actually need to thrive and to flourish. So it's a two-sided coin, but we shall keep going.
That's all we can do. And speaking of keep going, you've got some exciting things going on in your work. I'd love for our listeners and viewers to hear more. What are you working on right now?
Well, I'm working in a number of areas, and as I think about it, so much is connected to attachment, Jenna. So with the Canadian Pediatric Society, we are working on increasing the knowledge of early relational health. How important to pediatricians these first months, these first years are for kids. They know it, but we want to deepen their knowledge of it and also tell them what resources there can be. So there's a fantastic resource from Mount Sinai in the US of a Keystones, which is a curriculum for residents, so people who are studying to be a specialist. And that's fantastic. So increase the awareness and give them tools in their hand that they can actually use. So that's the Canadian Pediatric Society. Also in the infant range, I'm working with a number of communities in Ontario to develop resources like little videos for early childhood educators. And it's all about how do you build great, healthy social and emotional development in the early years. So we're getting at infant and early childhood mental health by teaching them how do you create it so it's really going to thrive. And then if there is an issue, you'll know how we're going to let them, educate them about what to do, what little one should we be worried about. And we're also going to be developing that in English and French, as well as with developing resources for parents. So the heart of the matter, the first video that we're going to make after the introduction is absolutely about attachment. And then the other area that I'm working in is with school systems, where I'm really focusing on how can the education system be more responsive to the emotional well-being of children, so that we can think and create an education system where kids are good at learning as well as good at life. That schools focus just as much on academic achievement. We want kids to learn, but what they learn, how they learn, and what's the environment around them. So that's the other big area. And attachment is huge. You can hear attachment is huge throughout that. Yeah.
I love hearing the different systems of influence that your work and your knowledge is going to have. So that's really exciting. And I can't believe how fast our time is just
I know
flying by. So what do you envision for the future of developing attachments and brains? And is there anything else you want to share with us too? Resources? How do you want to send us off, Dr. Jean?
You're right. So, I am optimistic about the future. It's very easy to get very depressed. We've got all of these crises going on. But there is a movement afoot that is saying that the well-being, the emotional well-being of children is really important in our education system, with our parents. And there are more and more, I'm experiencing, like I'm doing work in California just now, and there is, in some areas, a real movement towards, let's really look at how our children can be well in academic brain power as well as in life power. And so that creates a feeling of optimism for me, for sure. But the other huge thing is that people are finally, I think, recognizing the power of the adolescent brain, that kids don't have to be like Malala or the young woman in Sweden, but they can have a huge difference in creating the world that's going to be good for all kids. I can tell you story after story about kids who have stepped up and stepped in to help their community, to create more accessible ways for example, a community garden. But they had a problem in the community garden that people were stealing the food. And so kids came up with an amazing solution to that. So instead of people just coming in and taking what they wanted, they brought in some of the elders, the elderly, into the community, and not all into the garden itself. They opened it at certain times, and the elders were there. And not only did the people come in and get their stuff, but they also brightened up the elders. Also, the elders got to communicate and say, well, this is how you make this. This is how I love to do this. That was from the brains of a whole bunch of kids, adolescents. Mm-hmm. So we need to harness the power of adolescence. The indigenous people that I have heard from, my dear friend Diane Longboat, says there's an indigenous gift, a teaching that says that the children will bring the medicine home. Well, I think our earth, our nature, absolutely needs healing at this point. And I think it's going to be the children. If we let them, if we create the ecosystem, all of the intersecting parts, I think that that's where real change can happen.
Such a beautiful note of hope to end us on today, Dr. Jean. And it's no wonder they call you the knowledge translator, and you have planted so many seeds in so many gardens. So thank you so much. It was truly an honor to be here with you today. And I wish you well in your continued sharing of all your wisdom and the work that you're working on. And I look forward to when we can talk or our paths can cross again.
Oh, Jenna, I've really enjoyed it so much. And let me just share one little thing.
Sure.
People will hear that there was an airplane flying over as I was just finishing talking there. And I happen to know that that is a Lancaster plane, which is a very old plane. And how do I know that? Because my 4-year-old grandchildren, who are the twin boys, are crazy about the Lancaster and airplanes. So I'm not the only knowledge translator out there. Yes. It runs in the family. Yes.
Yes. Let the children translate for us too. They'll tell us. We have so much to learn for them. So thank you so much, Dr. Jean. Take good care.
My pleasure.
Bye.